Welcome back to part 3 of Dialectic and Rhetoric, the neglected parts of the Trivium. Today we will continue making our case that this needs to be recovered. And I had opportunity, thanks to some of the insights from the room yesterday, to update the end. And even reached out to my old professor, who has written some more. But we were asked this question in the hallway after session 2. How did Lutherans Lutheranize arrangement in preaching? So that Ciceronian outline that some others of you talked to us about in various fields, how did the Lutherans do it apart from mentioning all of the parts? We honestly didn't find much. We can review what LaRue says, what he discovers in Luther's Rhetoric, in his Invocavit sermons. We should read and analyze Lutheran sermons in order to answer this question better, but I did come up with this observation with some help. Luther often preaches or lectures verse by verse, following a structure of a biblical text. That tends to be my standby preaching structure, honestly. Luther follows a variety of sermon structures, including topical, sometimes ending whenever and however. I've been told stories about the St. Louis Chapel and the Fort Wayne Chapel, and the guy looks at his watch and he says, "That's enough for now." Luther includes references to current events as he applies law and gospel and does application. I had previously mentioned my class on sermon structures at Concordia St. Louis, and I accessed a new website that I had been previously unaware of. All of the sermon structures in this professor's repertoire for his classes are divided into 3. Please note the underline. We're going to follow that through the next few slides. Thematic structures, textual structures, and dynamic structures. Dynamic includes storytelling, first-person sermons, the so-called Lowry loop, if you've heard of such things. Under thematic structures, there's a whole big long list. Analogy, cause and effect, classical argument, classification, comparison, contrast, definition, paradox maintained. The movie. Problem, solution, process, and question answered. Classical argument. That's new. I mean, that's new to him, because that's not in my notes. Classical argument comes from an article dated 2011, concordiatheology.org/sermon-structs, as in structures, but leave out most of the word and end with an S. Overview. This structure interprets the teaching of the sermon as a point at issue in contemporary argument. In response, the sermon progresses according to the 5 parts of an argumentative discourse in classical rhetoric. Boom. And then he emailed me a couple of papers. And I have an appointment to meet with Professor Schmidt next week. I'm thrilled. So thank you for the tips from the crowd. He shows in one a parallel between this structure and how Luther preaches some sermons. Another one goes into goal, malady, and means by Kemmerer and makes the assertion, still don't have the direct quote memorized, but it assumes knowledge of this kind of classical thing. I believe that the relevance of this classical argument thematic structure for a sermon he sees as more relevant to the culture right now because of rising biblical illiteracy and people with very, very different religious opinions or moral opinions. That this would be a particularly well-suited structure for our time and place. using classical arrangement today in the pulpit or classroom. I have 2 slides to give you 2 possible options. And for inspiration, I noted the differences in how Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer. In Matthew 6, he says, "Pray then like this." We could use arrangement as elements in another sermon outline to cover all of the classical bases. Get all the info in there from classical arrangement, perhaps in the same way of Melanchthon's new synthesis of ancient oratory for the use of Christian preachers. That way we still get to use all that wonderful biblical Greek and Hebrew, answer the questions that arrangement gives us, and still have application. Or we could do it the way Jesus teaches in Luke 11. He says, to introduce the Our Father, when you pray, say. We could use this arrangement as an outline for a manuscript sermon or for a sermon without notes. I've tried both. It takes some discipline, Dr. Tallmon.
What's that?
Have you heard the phrase, we are all theologians? We are all liturgists. You're either witting or unwitting. So we are all rhetoricians. Are we unwitting ones or classical rhetoricians? Which rhetorics are we making use of when we speak? Preaching sermons with or without a manuscript. Pastors, if this is something you've been intimidated to try, I encourage trying it at school chapel. The sermons are shorter. You're preaching to kids. I mean, they're not that mean, they're short. Shut-in visits is another ideal time to try preaching without a manuscript. And transition, maybe at first, to an outline of what you'd like to say and have that strong finish in mind, just so it doesn't drop off a cliff like some transitions can, according to Gerhard. Teaching in the classroom, you may be used to applying your scope and sequence to a lesson plan and your lesson plan to your daily lecture and discussion. I see a parallel between that and the preaching that I've done as a regular substitute. Transitioning from the supplied rhetoric speech of the teacher edition to finding your own voice. And overall, working toward a revival, a conscious revival of classical rhetoric use in Lutheran education and preaching. I had the joy of reading this paragraph for the first time yesterday. My syllabus hasn't worked its way up to quintillion in my course of rhetoric study, so I got to skip ahead just a little bit here. Quintillion writes, "It is in the peroration," this is that last part of the classical outline, "if anywhere, that we must let loose the whole torrent of our eloquence. For if we have spoken well in the rest of our speech, we shall now have the judges on our side, and shall be in a position, now that we have emerged from the reefs and shoals, to spread all our canvas. While, since the chief task of the peroration consists of amplification, we may legitimately make free use of words and reflections that are magnificent and ornate." And so he did. So going forward, let us acquire some strength. And these are some topics for discussion, reflection, elucidation, all kinds of fun things that we could do as your co-presenters for this three-part. In pastoral care, I recommend a shepherding dialectic and rhetoric. What does this mean? I ask Socratic questions, not merely inductive questions, not merely comprehension questions in the classroom or in Bible class. I do want to see who's awake. I do want to keep the congregation awake and engaged. When it comes to answering questions in the classroom or in particularly Bible class, I find it important to help someone re-engage, to come back. Not just Sunday after Sunday or midweek after midweek, but within the same Bible class. Perhaps you'll field the question that if they would have read the homework, they'd know the answer to the question. This happens in Bible class, Dr. Tallmon. Sometimes someone will say, I've been a Lutheran all my life, and I've never heard of Lord, thee I love with all my heart. Just one of these embarrassing statements. How can we use what we know from classical ed and pedagogy to help that person save face? Another thing, I've mentioned this before, disputation as an alternative to the LCMS Koinonia project. Wyoming and Atlantic District did joint pastoral conferences in the spring of 2014 and the fall of 2015. We visited 4 boroughs in New York City and had a variety of food. We even saw a Yankees-Mets game. That was quite something. There were more fun activities even in Wyoming. We took the brothers shooting. We set up our own shooting range and went through $1,000 worth of ammunition in an afternoon. Of course, if you're doing it $5 at a time with a 50 BMG at a 300-yard steel target, that adds up rather quickly. But I don't know if all of that was worth the trouble and the money that was invested. In preparation for the initial one, we had a joint Wyoming-Montana District Winkle at Cody, Wyoming. Between the circuit visitors, we picked 3 topics for discussion, laid out some of the basics of how this works, and I still need to be taught a lot on disputation, to be honest. We set a time limit for each topic, and then we had brothers talk about those topics on the basis of Scripture and the Lutheran confessions and the Church Fathers. We found surprising differences between the Wyoming guys or the Montana guys, or differences between our 2 districts. But by the end of that initial segment on each topic, we made progress in agreeing with one another. I see it as a better way to go. That's my thought. Something near to the heart of Dr. Tallmon is a casuistry resource for pastors.
Yeah, I've been kicking this idea around since I brought it up with Pastor Burhop at Boulder, Colorado. I don't know, how long has he been gone from there now?
Boy, I don't know.
So it was the year before he left. Anyway, talked to Harold Sinkpile about it, and Professor Mays, a couple of other people, that pastors still engage in casuistry. And casuistry is a method of moral reasoning that was formulated in the Middle Ages by the Jesuits. In their confessional ministry, they needed to determine the appropriate amounts of penance for a given sin. And so it took on the shape of case reasoning, and then it was extended to all kinds of theological questions. But the bottom line was, according to my mentor, casuistry is a mode of rhetorical reasoning that in which you use topical reasoning to get down to the crux of the matter, and then determine, what's most relevant, and then make a judgment, and then render your judgment. So it's a good way for resolving moral dilemmas and that sort of thing. But in the Winkle, pastors will have a thorny question and they'll discuss it, and they call that casuistry. But what I'm not sure they're aware of is that there is a methodology that has a couple thousand years of history behind it that could be, explained in 20 pages, say, a 20-page introduction about the classical doctrine on casuistry. So they have a little more depth of understanding about where it came from and the heritage of it. And then what I was thinking of is my mentor, Albert Johnson, has a little clinical ethics book that he published with some of his friends in medical ethics and in clinical practice, an MD. They got together and, using topical logic, came up with stock issues in the care of patients in medicine and nursing that could be used to help people on the floor make decisions about thorny questions in a responsible manner. And so, I'm sorry, but it's a lot like the Syntopicon of the great books of the Western world. Are you familiar with that? The Syntopicon is a synthesis of topics. Thank you. A synthesis of topics that occur in the great conversation throughout the Western tradition. They're questions that have intrigued great thinkers, okay? And so 2 volumes in the great books of the Western world are organized around these topics. That's a list of all the topics in the Syntopicon. And those 2 fat volumes there are the Syntopicon of the great books of the Western world. But anyway, and they go from angel to world and all kinds of topics in between. Anyway, the important thing is that those topics help organize access to these writings from the great thinkers, okay? In Johnson's Clinical Ethics, which is a handbook that's about big enough to fit in a smock pocket, they have the stock issues of clinical care in medicine and nursing, and those are not patient preferences, medical indications, patient preferences, quality of life, and context. So anyway, under each of those, you have considerations. It prompts questions you could ask about what does the patient prefer? Was the patient fully informed and competent? Those are presuppositions of patient preferences. They have to be freely deciding and fully informed, okay? So anyway, all of those questions are listed, but then tied to those questions, this is where it's like the Syntopicon. I hope that makes sense now. It's like the Syntopicon in that those topics are elucidated with reference to court findings, professional standards, recent decisions that affect your decision, your immediate decision. So it's real practical handbook that guides decision making, and it's organized topically, and it's a mode of rhetorical reasoning.
Wow. All right, my brain's on fire now.
Every time.
This
is why we do this dog and pony show, because I stimulate him, and then
there's almost a library of these, right, in the history of the Lutheran Church. They're just on translation.
Right.
They're in Latin. And
that's a really good point. The little black book that pastors carried around in whatever language has been expanded under Lutheran Service Book to the Pastoral Care Companion. And there's a whole back section now of a variety of resources that could be understood how you're describing. At the time of birth, ministering to the sick, at the time of death, times of spiritual distress, home and family, vocation, times of celebration, and miscellaneous situations. It's
topically organized around seasons of life.
topically organized. So, for example, I can click on, there's an app version, anger and bitterness. There is an introduction, which I like to think of, here's how to keep your foot out of your mouth. That's how, yeah. Sinful anger and bitterness are destructive emotional responses expressed by an unwillingness to forgive others. When not dealt with, they devastate a person's relationship with God and the neighbor. The pastor will use the law to reveal such anger and bitterness as a fruit of unbelief. Proclaiming the unconditional forgiveness won by Christ, the pastor will point to the love of Christ, which constrains us to relinquish anger and to forgive those who have sinned against us, even as God in Christ has forgiven us. And then there's scripture. There's psalmody, additional psalmody, readings, collects, and even hymn stanzas as resources there. Now, the other thing I was thinking of, volume 2 of this casuistry resource for Christians could be to teach a faculty, a school faculty, or a collection of homeschool parents how to do casuistry to care for the children in their care. How about that?
It's limitless.
Yeah.
I worked with some engineers who were project managers on multi-million-dollar projects on reasoning this way to prompt the questions they need to ask so they don't make assumptions that cost millions of dollars in rework and oversight.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's taking classical learning and applying it to contemporary prudential conduct, so to speak.
Pastors will tell you at Winkle, casuistry sometimes ends with disagreement. You'll be told a couple of different valid, possible ways to handle the situation, and then on your 3-hour drive home in Wyoming district, you weigh them.
Yeah.
Or talk it over with your buddy down the road or your assistant pastor and figure out, all right, now what are we going to do? I'm always thankful to try to help somebody feel heard and help him solve his problems, and then be thankful as I go home to mine.
Yeah, that's actually, if I could piggyback on that point,
Please.
people are always looking for formulas. And like in jurisprudence, jurisprudentia, people want formulas. They want slot machine justice. Just put in all the elements of the case, pull the lever, and the decision comes out the bottom of the machine. But that's not how it works, and that's not how we should expect it to work. And it's a good thing. There's a lot of room for deliberation and dialogue and dialectic, and we work things out in a reasonable fashion. And I think that's really good to remember, because if we think that we're going to apply classical learning to these kinds of prudential considerations and then reduce that to formula, we just neutered the whole value of, that was a bad analogy, sorry.
It's like trying to pass Latin using Google Translate.
See, why can't I do that? I'm better at hallucinating, you're better at elucidating.
How about the idea of commonplace book? Let's dig into that.
Go.
Well, aren't there two different ways that this could be understood?
I'm sure there are, Pastor.
Oh, man. What have I heard? Well, I've heard of the theological commonplaces of someone like Johann Gerhard that I mentioned on a previous slide. Yes. And it's basically a doctrinal encyclopedia. But then more of a personal commonplace book might be teaching notes or sermon preparation notes for the next time that pericope comes around.
Or patterns I've noticed in my life where I stick my foot in my mouth.
Okay.
How to avoid those.
How to avoid those. That's cool.
That would be a personal collection of commonplace.
Yeah, topoi, topographic map,
Avoiding the minefield
avoiding them.
of
Yes,
my own
yes.
creation. George Washington's little book of, what did he call it? It's just observations, aphorisms.
Yeah, how not to screw up your life
That would be
book.
a commonplace book
That would be a commonplace
for
book.
virtue.
Pastors and teachers have different documents with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. They fill the function of a resume and a questionnaire. We've got a PIF and a SET, a personal information form and a self-evaluation tool. They just changed the name of the educator one. It used to be LEAF, and now it's something else. How about a commonplace sheet that describes a congregation's expected theology and practice that they throw into a call document packet?
The Braunschweig orders, you mean?
Well, yeah, that would definitely lay it out in a historical way. Yeah.
I was talking over with the board that I think it would be really useful to, instead of just doing site visits for accreditation to schools, do occasional visitation just for guidance and offering help.
There you go. That's a good idea.
Informal.
Right. We are hoping to have more additional regional training sessions, regional conferences, if you will. Keep the main CCLE summer ones going, but yes, your school, in fact, some of you have already talked to board members about hosting one of these.
So the certification site
Yeah.
visits are organized around all of the instruments that we've already invented for that purpose, but we would have to have something more like orders that serve when we do occasional informal visits.
Regional deans of the CCLE. Wow. Visitation. Yeah, that is fun. There's a question over here. Okay. All right. So what thoughts are you having, even if you don't have a question to bring before the two of us? How can we help? I'm still new at this too.
So, I would love for my children to be able to write, and whenever I see what they have, I see such a huge deficiency. I feel like there's no way they are gonna reach this final. How do I get them started? How do I get them, where do we start? I mean, right now, they're just beginning, they're third,
Right.
fifth, but I feel like I'm about to lose them, and to get them back would just be a real mountain. So where do you start, aside from good reading? How do I get them started writing?
That sounds like your bailiwick.
I'm thinking Catherine has an answer,
Yeah?
if not provision.
We started actually moving to the Progen a few years ago, so the Progen is not up.
Right.
And we formally introduced it starting in 3rd grade.
There you go.
So we've been using Classical Academic Press's curriculum, which is great. It essentially largely removes the creative element from writing. And in grades younger than 3, we do dictation exercises. So the idea is that writing is such a challenging thing to master because it involves thinking about what you want to say, writing, like physically writing what you want to say, and then actually following the laws of grammar and English. And that's so overwhelming to children. So if you remove that creative element, they can really focus on the more component skills of writing.
Yeah.
And then when they hit, dialectic phase, then they start having to write outlines and organize their own work and so on. So
And in the rhetoric phase, they'll use more imagination, style, and pathos to create beautiful works.
yes.
So there's reading, there's imitation, and even with in the imitation, I hear that you're breaking it down further into component parts so they understand the pieces of what they're trying to do.
Right. And writing then becomes not painful or excruciating, it's just kind of another part of the day.
There you go.
I think another thing too, more for your fifth grader, they should graduate from doing exercises and drill and that sort of thing to what are you interested in? It's really important to find out what interests them so they can, start to learn how to comment and then critique.
What do you think of the Shirley English way of doing it? Where they pick a topic and then there's 3-point paragraphs. By the time they get done outlining, they basically have their paper. This is for probably 4th and 5th grade.
Lutheran classical educators have been arguing about Shirley for 10 years at least. Many people have dumped it.
We've been modifying it for 15 years. And we're starting our 16th academic year. So honestly, there are some
Raging
neat
dissatisfaction.
parts, but lots of that's a good word.
So what have you done to modify it?
We've skipped some of the repetition. We've changed a lot of the examples and just gone with some of our own. In my time substituting over the last 9 years, I usually look at the other subjects and try to find something that is in one of the other subjects, either the book we're reading aloud or the history lesson or the Latin lesson, that teaches the same grammar lesson that we're trying to get across in that particular Shirley lesson, and I put that up on the board. So we had the surrender at Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. There's all kinds of fun things that could be said about that. So that became a writing prompt. What would a newspaper page look like for one of those events? And that was the writing prompt. And they could illustrate the picture if they wanted to. And of course, the boys, there's good muzzle doctrine. But
Where did they get that?
where would they get that? It's Wyoming. But we had compound sentences as the lesson of the day. And the Latin homework was Veni Vidi Vici by Caesar. Well, Pastor Cain, we have to translate that into English in order to divide the complete subject from the complete predicate. Yeah. Now put your marks on the Latin version. Well, in order to do that, we have to divide it at the end. Yes. And so they're learning something about grammar and Latin and coming and seeing and kicking some, I guess. By the way, you're not alone in trying to keep students engaged and alert and motivated. Sometimes human beings are just plain lazy and tired, and I want to do something different on a screen. But
So yes, Mrs. Wallen, we don't have time to talk Shirley
Sure.
here. It'll just go, it'll mushroom immediately.
Yes.
But I would say this, if I could and have the know-how to start a publishing house right now for classical education, I would call it second generation publishing house. And I would start taking advantage of the fact that there is a general level of dissatisfaction with all of the first generation books and tools. And people are already coming out with fresh things that are much deeper, more well thought out. They have the benefit of more time working on them. They weren't trying to jump the market, So I think it's time now to identify the next great level of resources. And I have a suggestion. It's got nothing to do with what we're talking about. It's just that the guy's in Austin, and he spent 5 years working out. He taught at Regents in Austin, which is the most elite classical school in the town. And he just spent 5 years writing textbooks in science and math. Novari, science and math. Check it out. He's got the goods. I've talked to the guy at a conference at the Society for Classical Learning.
Those kids are sharp.
wow, a second generation Saxon, Spalding, Shirley. Yeah, this would be fun.
Our school in Trinity in Cheyenne went to a CCLE conference when they were just starting 12 years ago, 13 years ago, and they were told, you have to do Shirley grammar and Saxon math and all this. So they bought all the books and taught from the books and everything, but it just got so stale after a while. We did a lot of revision the 3 years I was there. And my 6th and 7th graders actually took our Abeka science books down to the dumpster and ripped them up and threw them in. It was so cathartic. They were so sick of those things. So they had just they've been trying to economize, so they were overusing the materials. And they were also, this is a clue, this is pedagogical, again, it's not that related to this, but while I'm on the subject, one thing that became really apparent to me as a new headmaster is I was working with 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and I had some really wonderful, very honest kids that were saying things like, I pretty much checked out 2 years ago because I was so sick of the repetition. And it was kind of magnified there because the teachers only knew what they had learned at that first conference, and they were repeating it and using the books, and most of the books had workbooks, So prolonging the grammar stage beyond its utility will blow up in your faces. Don't do it. It's easier, but it's not better. And we don't teach people's children and teach our own children love of learning because we want them to, wait a minute. We send them to classical schools because we want them to cultivate love of learning, and to kill that is a travesty.
Right.
Sorry.
No,
I'm
that's
preaching now.
all right. Laleo, is that the Greek? It's one of the Greek words.
Along that line of thinking, if a student hasn't had a subject that they have a firm grammar base in, but they're at an age that they are actually at a dialectic level or rhetoric level, how do you balance that? Do you reach back into the grammar stage, or do they naturally do that as they are trying to, as an individual, make sense of things?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
So-
Honestly, I'm so easily distracted. I saw Catherine writing something and I didn't hear the first part. I'm that easily distracted.
So let's say you have a
Horrible.
new student who hasn't gone through all the grammar levels. Like,
Yeah.
Let's say in Latin.
Just came to the school a
Right.
couple years ago. Yeah.
Exactly. And so
Gotcha.
you're still working through material on the grammar level, but they have moved cognitively into a reasoning level that is dialectic or rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle mastery of content?
How do you handle remediation in a
Right.
classical school context?
Exactly. Do the students naturally do that themselves, or is it something that we have to supervise?
If their parents will help them,
Well,
I think
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah, but
The children can do it. They still need to learn the grammar of any new subject, just like we do. Moving to Wyoming, I had to learn the grammar of a whole lot of new subjects that I have since become proficient in. But you may have multiple ages within the same intro course. But what you said about parents, you want to elaborate on that?
well, I wasn't planning on elaborating on that because it's self-evident. If the parents have to kind of know too.
Yeah.
Most parents at our schools feel inadequate.
When we get new students, second grade and up, that have never encountered classical education at all, the child is going to have a rough first month that fall.
Yeah.
The parents are going to have a rough 2 months. And you just kind of need to be there with them and say it'll get better.
I thought it was brilliant the way we handled it in the school because we rotated and they were grouped according to their levels, not their age. So a child new to the school would go to beginner Latin and then have to graduate. as they learn. And you expect them to pick it up a little more quickly than the little ones, but they went to the level of Saxon math where they were at, not according to their class.
But doesn't that violate what you just said, that don't keep using the grammar stage with children that have cognitively outgrown that?
We're talking about people who are new to classical education.
Or a subject.
So the
Yeah.
question why I raised it is because I homeschool, and so I'm
Yeah.
the one providing the education.
Mhm.
I had 3 kids in second form Latin last year. The previous year, we had done first form Latin, flew right along. And I had 2 kids pull away from the youngest one in second form. So cognitively, he's asking, we're able to work on dialectic or a rhetoric level, but, he had a wall for like second form Latin. So I know that a lot of people do that in much younger grades, but we did not because we weren't exposed to it.
Side note, it makes my heart sing to hear you using the term dialectic rather than logic. I do think
Sorry.
that's more proper
Yeah,
because of
I
the
agree.
relationship of
I
dialectic to
agree.
rhetoric.
And I think I'm kind of attuned to that because of the curriculum that I was used, and they use that for that age group rather than the logical kind of intellectual construct. So,
I like the specificity of referring to it as dialectic because it's specifically tied to the trivium and the skill set that goes along with the cognitive development,
right.
the disputation and the argumentation, all that sort of thing.
So that would vary, I mean, the way dialectic and rhetoric are used, that would vary for subject, or is it just, are you just like in that phase of life, the logical?
There are
Dr.
Dr.
Beat me up if I say it the wrong way.
Yeah, there you go. You've got the stages that Sayers lays out, but as a teacher, you've got all of those in your toolbox as pedagogical tools.
It's a both and in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd say there's a grammar to learning logic. You need to learn the grammar of logic.
Yeah.
Memorial Press has materials, guys.
Now, correct me if you're wrong, when you said don't prolong the grammar stage any farther than you have to, you're referring to when it's broken down by stage and ages instead of using it in conjunction with the other ones.
Of course,
Okay.
yeah.
So like,
It's
some
both,
yeah,
it's both valid to talk about the cognitive
Yes.
development stages that go
Mhm.
along with those terms.
as long as you don't
And
state
that
it.
each subject has a grammar, a dialectic, and a rhetoric,
Mhm.
or a logic to it.
Because I think some of the impression I've gotten, I don't teach in a regular school in the traditional sense, but the impression I've gotten sometimes the grammar schools get really focused on the grammar stage and
Right.
almost to the exclusion of the other two.
Yeah,
So you don't wanna
ACCS
do
schools are
that,
hardcore about that.
especially going too far.
So there are stages, there are content areas, and there are pedagogy. So.
Not that you can't do grammar stage stuff later on.
There are many facets to understanding the
Yeah.
dynamic of age-appropriate education and classical content. So it's a both and,
Yeah.
if you ask me. And
Yeah.
I don't
No, I
like to
agree.
make it an either or,
I agree.
where they're
Yeah.
exclusive of one another.
You're limiting yourself to make it either or.
I think so.
Right. Yeah. Both and. That's a wonderful
But it
thing.
gives you a good hobby horse to,
But we're Lutherans, we like tension.
Dorothy Sayers.
I-
Let's throw Dorothy under the bus.
Oh, poor Dorothy. Her little dog. We do encourage you to have fun with it. Start somewhere and keep at it. But let's be intentional about studying rhetoric and dialectic. Hopefully give that a little more attention next go around.